Before this video begins, I would just like to thank my Asbantium level patron, Fowlon Cortez. Thank you for supporting the channel. Doctor Who is dead. Again. Apparently. We don't actually know. Things are weird right now. The last few years of the show have seen big returns, high concept storytelling, and the idea that the Doctor is more than a normal Time Lord. And if it is the end, it was a sudden and unplanned one. And funnily enough, this has happened before. Yes, the final years of so-called Classic Who saw a similar approach and abrupt ending, ushering in the wilderness years full of novels, audio dramas, failed reboots, and the TV movie with our Lord and Saviour, Paul McGann. #McGannGang. But right near the end of this period, in 2001, the show saw an unconventional continuation. Death Comes to Time. And it was supposed to be the end of everything. So, what is this animated audio story, and how does it work as the apparent end of Doctor Who? Well, thanks to my loyal Patreon supporter Daniel Shillito commissioning this video, that's what I'm here to find out. By now, we all know the story of how Doctor Who died in the 1980s. It fell out of the public consciousness, faced constant budget cuts, and fell victim to internal sabotage, being outright cancelled, albeit quietly, at the turn of the 1990s. Of course, even the production team didn't know just how soon the show would be taken out back and shot. As always, they had already started planning for season 27. Fully expecting business as usual, this season would have been Sylvester McCoy's last, seeing the 7th Doctor regenerate at the end, along with Sophie Aldred leaving halfway through the season, with Ace taken to Gallifrey to become a Time Lord. These plans would unfortunately never come to fruition, with Survival the end of Doctor Who's televised life for many years. However, there were still attempts to continue the show in an animated format, like I've previously explored in my video about the scrapped Nelvana cartoon series. Go watch it. Eventually, at the turn of the century, the BBC decided to dip its toes into the emerging webcast format. Videos formatted for broadcasting online on websites. Remember, all you young whippersnappers out there, this was pre-YouTube, a time when sites like that didn't exist. The first such webcast was Death Comes to Time, a 5-part animated story released on the BBCi website with a successful pilot in July 2001, leading to a full release from 14th of February to 3rd of May 2002. I guess they knew most Doctor Who fans aren't exactly usually very busy on Valentine's Day. Death Comes to Time is a weird part of Doctor Who continuity. It's essentially the ending of Classic Who, even ignoring the TV movie that had come out a few years before, and therefore, as is tradition by this point, making a complete mess out of continuity. Although, as we'll touch upon later, there are still some ways to make it fit, because of course there are. It's Doctor Who. Death Comes to Time borrows from a lot of genres, mixing historical fantasy with slick space opera. I mean, hell, the opening is literally a Star Wars space battle, complete with TIE Fighter laser sound effects. No, genuinely, it's the same sound. The evil General Tanis invades and conquers the Santine Republic, and he's very comically evil, with he and his forces committing some lovely war crimes. The first thing you need to know about Death Comes to Time is that it's not a traditional animation. It's actually more of a slideshow of drawings accompanying what is essentially an audio drama. It's very simplified, but it makes the audio drama format a lot more accessible than it otherwise would be, giving people something to actually look at and a visual reference to characters and events. Something that you don't really get with things like Big Finish audios, which are purely audio only and therefore put off a lot of potential audience. However, this also presents the biggest problem for Death Comes to Time. It's not exactly accessible on a writing level. It's a very waffly and technical story, throwing out lots of terms and made up words. It's pretty impenetrable, and at times, downright boring, I can't lie. You know, they'll be throwing out things constantly being like, oh, we need to get to Mount Ploffledorp to meet the ancient sage Gizmark, and they'll be able to show us the secret to defeating the Schleimkorps, and it's like, who cares? Death Comes to Time is perhaps one episode too long, since there's a whole part early on dedicated to the Doctor chasing after a vampire assassin in London, which is kind of unrelated and a bit of a tangent until it suddenly ends up becoming relevant later on, purely so the climax can take place on Earth. And the Brigadier was there? This Earth tangent is because of pesky temporal disturbances, because that's the crux of the story. Time going funky, and funky Time Lords. Throughout Classic Who, the Time Lords were always kind of stuck in one mode, squabbling and holier-than-thou politicians. It worked great for stories like The Deadly Assassin, but it got boring after a while, especially with Trial of a Time Lord ensuring nobody wanted to see them ever again. In this regard, Death Comes to Time attempts to make the Time Lords mystical and interesting again. It introduces us to Gods of the Fourth, a specific ancient Time Lord sect who are more monk-like and philosophical than the Time Lords we'd grown to know throughout Classic Who. Hell, from the way Ace's teacher Casmus talks about what it means to be a Time Lord, you'd think they were Jedi with their temples and vows to never have romantic partners or children. I mean, hell, just call them Doctor Who fans at that point. Where the original series had framed non-interference as a political policy, a neutrality out of political principle, Death Comes to Time changes it to be a deliberate philosophical and theological vow of responsibility. I won't lie, I've always found the Time Lords pretty boring, but in theory, this is a very interesting slant on them, giving them these new layers and turning them more theological and almost like they worship time itself, rather than just wielding it as a power. But unfortunately, I do feel like it does so in a very dry way. Yes, our main source of Time Lord mythology here comes in the form of Ace learning how to become one, picking up on that idea from the Lost Season 27. She's rescued from a prison ship by the mysterious Casmus, who takes her under his wing and teaches her the ways of wearing silly hats and talking about being inside a philosophical painting or whatever that scene's about. She begins training under him and the Kingmaker, essentially the leader of this monastic order of the Fourth. I've always liked the idea of Time Lord being a title rather than a race. It just feels like something that should be earned and bestowed upon someone who has gone through harsh and challenging trials, just like we see Ace going about. I suppose I see it in the same way Andrzej Sapkowski envisioned the process of becoming a Witcher. It's a brutal, often fatal process to undergo. You have to give a lot of yourself in exchange for this promise of great power and ability. It's interesting how Ace's failure on Anima Persis is revealed as purposeful, a deliberate process of instilling a sense of hubris and humility, thus emphasising the importance of their non-interference beliefs and their philosophy. That's the difference between becoming a Time Lord. Ace learning when and why not to act. It completes that clear mythology of the Time Lords as an order. Just because they have this power doesn't give them the right to use it. They're not trained to be incredible gods. They're trained to refuse, to know their limits. It actually adds some nuance to the Doctor not adhering to the non-interference policy. Up until this point, the policy itself seemed a bit ridiculous and obvious that the Doctor would reject it. But through Ace's training, we can actually understand and rationalise why it exists. By being forced to fail through interference in order to become a Time Lord, each one carries a scar of humiliation and shame that constantly reminds them of their responsibility despite their powers. It's a title earned through an exploration of ethics rather than anything purely academic or hereditary. Again, it's all great on a conceptual level, and the ideas are fantastic, but in practice, it feels so dry and unengaging. More suited for prose, maybe one of those Virgin New Adventure books of the 90s that are just all over the place. But the thread of Time Lord mythology wouldn't be complete without the so-called Minister of Chance, another rogue Time Lord we meet in the story, and one of its most important and crucial components. He joins the story by summoning the Doctor to the Temple of the Fourth, before himself then joining the unfolding crisis on Santini. He's another example of the struggle between interference and non-interference, and he's portrayed very well by Stephen Fry. Yeah, he's there. The Minister is almost like a parallel Doctor, which is very intentional, as I'll get to in a bit. He faces the same kinds of scenes and ethical dilemmas the Doctor himself usually faces, becoming entrenched within this war for Santini as the rebel former government attempts to fight back against the forces of Tanis, who himself extorts his own great leader and takes soft power over the Canisian Empire. See, there I go with all the words again. It's just an onslaught of technobabble and weird 90s sci-fi nonsense. The story faces a problem with the amount of viewpoint characters it has. There's the Doctor, Antimony, Ace, the Minister and Tanis all competing for screen time as the story unfolds, which can get pretty messy at times. But it's not a mortal sin, and the Minister of Chance is interesting enough to carry his own subplot as he initially dances on the edge of the conflict. Very Doctor-like in that regard, until he's pushed over the line and gives in to the temptation to use his godlike powers to save others. It's another example of that struggle Ace also sees, although this time not in the controlled illusion world of the Kingmaker. And the consequences of this action are extreme, the Minister fracturing the very fabric of time he's sworn to protect and causing the same temporal damage the Doctor has been investigating. Indeed, out of grief, the Minister falls to temptation and loses track of his discipline and his restraint. It's a cruel turn because you understand the Minister's grief and why it forces him to involve himself, but he breaks the code further than even the Doctor does. So, ironically, the Doctor is the one forced to punish his own friend by revoking the Minister's TARDIS. It retains the religious overtones, an excommunication of sorts, something the Doctor himself experienced back in the War Games, left with a TARDIS he could never fly as a constant reminder of breaking the non-interference policy. It is also, of course, perfect fuel for the spin-off continuation Death Comes to Time was meant to softly launch. There was the intention to follow the Minister going forward, this charismatic excommunicated Time Lord stripped of his ship and forced to find new ways to move between worlds. And this would eventually come to fruition, albeit in a legally distinct way using magic doors rather than a TARDIS, because the spin-off was much later on and not fully licensed. So it exists in that weird, nebulous zone a lot of BBV and real-time productions float in. Yes, I'm thinking of the Zygon one again. One day I'm gonna have to make a video about that goddamn mess. You're not ready. Speaking of weird oddities, it might come as a surprise to you that the Doctor and Ace are almost entirely apart during this story, a stark contrast to where they left off in Survival. Instead, the 7th Doctor is joined by new companion Antimony, an unsettlingly chipper and agreeable character that never quite feels right or natural. He's almost too obedient and friendly compared to Ace or even Mel before him. There's an off-putting naivety about him because he's clearly alien and he's incapable of understanding a number of basic concepts any human would know. However, this all turns out to be very intentional for the story, as he's brutally and rather casually killed by the villain Tanis, revealing the truth that Antimony is completely artificial, a friend and loyal companion engineered to never leave the Doctor's side. This is a fascinating idea for a companion, and something that almost formed the basis of Rose Tyler when the show eventually returned, since there was an early concept where it would be revealed that the 9th Doctor had been carefully manipulating events in Rose's life and grooming her to become the perfect companion. Antimony is very similar, someone the 7th Doctor could design to follow his every instruction and order without question. It further adds to that dark chess master persona of this incarnation. He's so desperate for control, he'd even stoop to creating someone he can perfectly control with ease and comfort. It's both dark and kind of tragic in a way you almost pity him for it. It's control born from the fear of loss. He doesn't want to keep losing the people he trusts and holds close to him, and this desire for control is what ultimately causes loss in a cruel and fitting twist of fate. The manipulator who grooms others to play his long game literally builds a loyal follower who then dies because he brings it to a battlefield. The Doctor pays for his own hubris, believing he could solve all his problems through artificial life and obedience, but even that isn't enough to beat Tanis. A phrase repeated multiple times in this story is "even Time Lords die," which is very chilling foreshadowing, and also something proven repeatedly by villain General Tanis, who is ultimately responsible for the deaths of multiple Time Lords in this narrative. He's a very powerful, all-conquering villain who revels in the ability to kill and dominate others. Tanis is partially just a typical cackling supervillain, but things take an interesting turn when he admits he himself is a Time Lord. This creates a fascinating and very thematic layer as we see how he wages war conventionally, as a way to avoid breaking the laws of time and incurring the punishment of his kind. Not that he would really care anyway, which is a weird element of the story, but it's almost like a game, to cause as much chaos as possible without tapping into his Time Lord powers or alerting the Time Lords. He basically pushes other people to do it for him. A very interesting twist on the typical Time Lord villain archetype. The Kingmaker herself even admits how evil Tanis is, but acknowledges he hasn't violated the laws, so she can't intervene. Instead, it's people like the Minister of Chance who suffer punishments for trying to stop Tanis. Such is the nature of the trap he pushes his enemies into. And it's a trap he seeks to push the Doctor into as well. Towards the end of the story, Tanis turns his sight, inevitably, towards Earth.
It's time to conquer Earth!
After all, he is a Doctor Who villain. They're drawn to Earth like moths to a flame. And it comes down to a confrontation at Stonehenge. Yeah, sorry Pandorica opens, that setting wasn't even unique. Yet another reason you're overrated. This final confrontation takes the form of a ground battle between the Brigadier's unit and Tanis' own forces, returning to the very space opera sci-fi atmosphere the story began with. It's a fitting climax, especially as part of Tanis trapping the Doctor with the Time Lord's version of the trolley problem. Does the Doctor adhere to the code, remaining small but faithful whilst countless lives are lost? Or does he give in to the temptation to save them with his powers at the cost of betraying his creed? And for extra stakes, it's Ace who is most at risk. I mean, Tanis literally starts beating her to death, which is pretty intense. I find it really interesting just how powerful Tanis is shown to be. It's implied he basically wipes out all of the Time Lords, with the Doctor the only one left able to stand in his way. And thus, the Doctor is forced to tap into his forbidden powers, destroying Tanis for the greater good, but knowingly paying the price by himself disappearing too. It's the culmination of the story, which over and over again stresses the importance of resisting this power and maintaining responsibility. So we can truly understand that this is the absolute last resort for the Doctor, sacrificing himself in a blaze of glory to stop Tanis. Like I said, Tanis basically ends up with a victory either way, and thus, as the last two active Time Lords, they both vanish at the climax, leaving Ace to herald a new age as she becomes a Time Lord herself in this new, Doctor-less universe. And that's how Death Comes to Time ends, essentially concluding Doctor Who as a show by passing the mantle to the companion as the Doctor dies, or at least seems to die. I've spoken before about how Doctor Who could possibly end, since it's not an easy concept to execute. The show is so infinite, so full of potential and possibilities, the idea of outright ending it almost feels wrong and bad faith, kind of sacrilegious. Survival was the ideal goodbye to Doctor Who. The Doctor and Ace walking off into the sunset with the promise of more worlds to save. But Death Comes to Time attempts a very concrete and final ending by writing the Doctor out in this intense, high-stakes way. He embraces godhood at the cost of his own life, and symbolically leaves his iconic umbrella behind. It's very much an intentional conclusion to the entire show as a whole. Even though I don't like the idea of ending Doctor Who so concretely like this, it is fitting. And of course, it's very ambiguous anyway, you can still squeeze it into continuity as him faking his death. But the ending of Death Comes to Time is still interesting regardless, almost a Tolkien-esque idea of ages. It's like the end of the third age of Middle-earth, the Time Lords departing the universe just like the elves, leaving Ace alone to shepherd in a new era of her own. It's the final knot in that string of sci fantasy, a mythology of the Time Lords as they face their twilight, and the show ends for good. And that's the point of the title. It's the end of Doctor Who, permanently. death coming to time in this climactic finale. Even with this continuity mess, many fans would be able to consider this the actual end, not acknowledging the TV movie because of its weird production and rights issues. So Death Comes to Time could have worked as a valid conclusion to the franchise had Russell T Davies not brought it back just a few years later. Is it a good ending? I'm not so sure, but it's definitely a wild one. There are vampires, TIE fighter laser sounds, Stephen Fry's a Time Lord, the Brigadier, Time Lord monks in caves, and of course the Doctor straight up yeeting himself out of existence. They certainly threw in a lot of ideas. It's just a shame it doesn't all mesh. Yes, despite it being full of cool concepts and a rich soundscape, Death Comes to Time just isn't very compelling. Of course, there are a lot of positives like the Time Lord mythology and the 7th Doctor's final speech, but the delivery throughout the story is dry and bland. Things like the Minister becoming so grief-stricken he turns into a proto-Time Lord Victorious just feel contrived and unrealistic within the bounds of the story. And sure, the Time Lords are interesting with the whole non-interference policy being turned into spiritual practice rather than boring politics. But it feels weird for the Time Lords to suddenly be upturned like this and completely changed into becoming like wizards and gods. In fact, all the talk of balance just turns them into B-Tech Jedi in the worst way possible. Especially because, remember, this came out right hot on the heels of Phantom Menace and around the time of Attack of the Clones, so not a great time to be trying to be Jedi. I love Ace's journey to become a Time Lord, but so much of it drags painfully, with technobabble rambling and attempts to sound philosophical and deep with these metaphors of perspective and creation. The whole story is just so slow, and still, strangely, manages to feel rushed by the end. Despite his interesting premise, Tanis just kind of ends up being a moustache-twirling typical villain without realising the potential his setup promises. Overall, I don't know if I could earnestly recommend Death Comes to Time as a good piece of Doctor Who media. It's not very accessible, and it feels like it's trying to be a whole different franchise with a Doctor Who's name just awkwardly slapped on it. But that being said, it's still a very fascinating oddity within Doctor Who. It exists within its own strange world. If you try hard enough, you can still fit it into the chaotic continuity of the Wilderness Years. It doesn't quite pay off what the McCoy era was building towards, but it still tries to at least conclude those storyline ideas of the Doctor being more than a Time Lord and Ace herself becoming a Time Lord. So it's interesting as a sort of season 27 of its own, ignoring the TV movie and the 2005 reboot for its own unique ending. But what do you think of Death Comes to Time? If you've even heard it, that is. Let me know in the comments. Thank you very much for watching, and as always, I'll see you in the next one. Bye bye. And I'd just like to thank my Asbantium level patron, Fallon Cortez, my Diamond level patrons, Sapphic Flame and Valtar, and all my Gold level patrons, Daniel Shillito and James Aleula Waterhouse. Thank you for supporting the channel.